Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. I just did a video breaking down some of the Age of Empires 4 footage that we've seen, but in this one I want to specifically look at the gameplay trailer at the end of the fan preview where they show some actual games between the new civilizations across the 4 different ages. This is different footage that I didn't get access to early enough to include in the previous video, and it's crazy how much footage they released, so let's jump into it. The first thing we see is the Dark Age and initial city building in a game between the English and Delhi Sultanate. As it turns out, the names for different ages appear to be the same as in Age of Empires 2. The economy side all looks pretty familiar, with mills, lumber camps, and mining camps. Obviously, they're sticking with the Age of Empires 2 drop-off resource collection model over the Age of Empires 3 model, which I think is a good call and encourages more city planning. We also get an interesting look at a scout being able to collect sheep, which are also much faster than we're used to seeing. Given the extra emphasis in Age of Empires 4 that we've seen on historical accuracy, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't like sheep scouting. Between the earlier hunting shots and now gathering sheep, you get the sense that English scouts at least are important for early resource collection. We also get a shot of some palisades being built and farms laid out around a mill. I love all the little paths, and compared to earlier shots, it seems paths auto-generate between buildings, which I think is a really nice touch. I always like the idea of a road building mechanic, either for trade units or to move military around the map more quickly, and even if this is just a visual thing and doesn't actually have a function of speeding up units, I think it adds a lot to the aesthetic. Next, we see a bit of scout raiding and the ways that you can defend against that. Notice here that the villagers are defending with knives, though in the next shot as we jump ahead to the English villagers, we see that their villagers can use bows to defend. That seems like a cool historical nod to the fact that at various points, English peasants were legally required to own a bow and train at archery. It seems the combination with their swordsmen is pretty tough, at least in this fight. Now onto the scaffold and time-lapse building, which I'm not quite sure how to feel about this. I get the idea of not wanting to just have units pounding the foundation with a hammer to build it, but having ghostly specters teleporting all around it is also a little strange. What's cool is that when the building is done, all of the other buildings around it are upgraded. So it seems at least the English reach the next age through creating buildings, like Japanese in Age of Empires 3. We then switch to a Mongols versus Chinese game, this time picking up in Feudal Age. Unlike the English town, we notice the Mongols don't have any walls, and everything is connected to a central building. We also get to see a very unique mechanic for Mongols, where they have a notification that their ovu is depleted, so the town center either is destroyed or just collapses on its own, after which they move to a new stone pile and build a new one. From this, it looks like Mongols are going to have a very unique nomadic playstyle. I'm curious about what you do if you run out of stone piles on the map or can't find any, but until then, it seems you're meant to move at least once in the game. It brings up interesting strategic questions, like what do you do if your opponent is controlling the stone piles, but I'm sure that's addressed through map design and civ balance. We get another good look at the fire mechanic again as well, and depending on how exactly that ends up working, it makes for some potentially interesting ideas around unit design. Maybe some units can be especially good at running through someone's town and lighting buildings on fire, while others are better at just picking off villagers. Again, it seems like they're trying to address a lot of the weird logic in previous games, like how buildings could stay on fire forever. Moving on, in this shot, we actually get to see a barracks that's being clicked on and what the unit production and upgrade UI looks like. It's fairly intuitive and similar to previous Age games with units and upgrades grouped together. Something else you'll notice on the screen is that we now have 4 enemy landmarks to destroy, whereas in earlier shots we only had 3. Again, this seems like it's trying to address an issue in Age of Empires 2 of players running around and hiding in corners by giving you core buildings you need to destroy, like castles and town centers, rather than every single building and unit. Next, we jump ahead to Castle Age and back to the Delhi Sultanate and English matchup. As you'd expect, everything's a lot further along now, and we get a good look at some siege equipment available. I really like that archers are actually on top of walls now, maybe with an attack and range bonus, or protection from arrows. One criticism I have of this fight is I think the arrows from towers and castles are a bit too large personally, and it does give it a bit of a cartoony vibe. That said, maybe in the final version you can scale the size of that sort of thing, or at the least it can probably be modded to something more reasonable. There's also one moment in the trailer I'm a little nervous about performance as well, as there's a momentary stutter in the footage as the gate starts to collapse. It reminds me of the Definitive Edition, where the destruction animations, especially just after release, did cause some stuttering. In fairness, they still have quite a few months to optimize things further, so I'm not necessarily worried at this point, and the destructions overall look pretty good. It's nice that as buildings are destroyed, you start with little pieces falling off first before the whole thing collapses. Now as they zoom out here, one thing I notice is that the cities are very large. I wonder if cities are actually going to end up looking like this in competitive play, or if we'll look back on this clip as just scenario editor eye candy. You can tell this is actually the earlier town that we saw at the beginning of the video, as the layout is identical. You can then see how the city's grown in waves, and they built a couple of castles and eventually expanded out enough to make a second wall. The city tells a kind of story of how it grew, and presumably this was a game that was actually played, and that's what the cities might end up looking like. As we pan over to the other side of the map, we can see the other player city has a bit less of that, but it still strikes me as being very spread out. Interestingly, notice the farmers are all around mills and not the town center, which is the standard in Age of Empires 2. I admit I'm getting hung up on the roads and aesthetics a lot, but just look at the detail on one of the roads and how it's fancier after a nearby building is finished. As you make more buildings, it seems like all of the infrastructure around them is going to slightly improve, which is a nice little detail I'd expect in a city building game and wouldn't be looking for in a real-time strategy. And finally, we jump to the Imperial Age, back to our Chinese versus Mongols matchup. Again, if these roads automatically generate, I'm going to be incredibly stoked about this, and just look at all the little details that you see in the town. It's always hard to know how much of this is set up in the scenario editor, but I love all the little ponds and baskets lying around that make it feel like a city that's being lived in. We also get a great zoom in with a ton of detail. This particular unit also seems to generate 6 gold when it reaches this building, which is possibly a market, but if this is a 1 versus 1, that would mean you can trade within your empire, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. As we tour the city, we also get to see a large variety of units, including some good shots of archers, including some crossbows, bowmen, and early gunpowder units. With infantry, you can see we have a couple of types of spear units and also some more heavy infantry, and again we see the same sort of variety of weaponry when it comes to cavalry. We also get to see 4 types of siege units shown in here as well. The next shot we have is of the Mongolian late game army. We see tons of heavy cavalry and cavalry archers as you'd expect, with some other units mixed in. I'm hoping there's systems in place to actually encourage players to use the level of variety that is shown here in actual combat. I also have to shout out the Season 8 Game of Thrones tactics on display with the Chinese walking outside of their walls in order to fight. Of course, I get they're doing it for cinematic effect and would prefer to have an open field battle here. Every late game battle we've seen with Chinese seems to be filled with a lot of gunpowder, explosions, and fire, etc., and look pretty lively, at least compared to AoE 2. Personally, I'm all for that as long as you can still tell what's actually going on. The Chukanu is also in this fight as well, showing there's a lot of variety in archer units for the Chinese. It's also entirely possible that some of these units are upgrades of others though, in order to show off as much content as possible. Something really different we get a good look at though is Mongolian cavalry archers can fire at an angle while moving. We've also seen a couple of times now that the Mongols can light some blue fireworks, and I'm not quite sure what that's all about. They could be a special ability of the hero unit, as we have seen hints already that hero or general units might have some special abilities. There's obviously a hero or general unit here for the Mongols, which could be the equivalent of an Age of Empires 3 Explorer. Also in the fight, we get a good shot of the Chinese fire lancers that are charging into some crossbows as well, and I'm curious about how exactly that mechanic works. Of course, you have to love the massive trebuchets as well, and their scale is something that wasn't really captured in other Age games. Overall, I think the battle looks really nice, though obviously it's staged to show off a ton of features and units with just the best clips. It does make me a bit curious about what computer specs are going to be required when it's finally released. With all the detail in the terrain and the particle effects going on, I'm really hoping it's not too much for the average computer. Of course, that's something that I'm sure they're paying a lot of attention to in the closed beta, which you can sign up for at ageofempires.com. So that's a look at all of the footage that we've seen so far. I think the biggest surprise to me about the game is how asymmetrical the civilizations are. Mongols in particular being a nomadic civ is a pretty radical departure, and it'll be interesting to see all the civilizations in the end, and how creative they get with their playstyles. We've already seen a lot of new mechanics, and I'm sure they're also saving up a few to reveal later. So far, I think it does capture the style of Age of Empires, though the real test in the end is going to be how it feels to play. Does it give fun and rewarding trade-offs and hook players in the same way that previous Age of Empires titles did? Personally, I really don't see this as a direct competitor with Age 2, even though they're both set in the same time period. My hope is that when everything's said and done and it's released, it feels like a different enough game that I'd play Age 2 and Age 4 when I'm in different moods and looking for a different experience. Based on what we're seeing, it makes me feel like city building and planning is going to be emphasized more in Age 4. Though again, this is alpha footage, and I'm sure the game is undergoing changes even now based on fan discussion and reaction. That's going to be it for this one though. Let me know what you guys think and let the devs know, as I'm sure they're reading the forums and probably even the comments on videos like this one. Most people watching this are probably Age 2 fans, and I'm sure they care a lot about what you guys think of what's been shown thus far. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.